Hello, and welcome to RGS at Home language tutorials. My name is Klaudia Grechuta, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher in SPECS Lab at the Institute of Bioengineering of Catalonia. And in this particular tutorial, we will address the question of how the brain controls speech and language. Indeed, language processing is divided into a number of subfunctions. So in order to address this question, we will be covering 5 topics. First, we will discuss basic neuroanatomy of language and specifically the notion of lateralization. Secondly, we will go through the main language areas and their involvement into language processing. Third, we will look at how the language is being comprehended, how it is produced, and finally, we will talk about the consequences of damage to different language processing systems. Let's start with some basic neuroanatomy. One of the characteristics of the neurobiology of language is that it is lateralized. The lateralization of brain function is the notion that some functions are localized and hence they're being processed largely in one side of the brain. Indeed, human brain lateralization for language is probably one of the most distinctive lateralization that there are, other than the handedness. You may wonder, however, how do we study this phenomenon? Well, language lateralization was mostly studied by looking at patients who have suffered a brain damage due to an accident or stroke. And what we have learned from those patients is that 90% of right-handed people have their language function centralized in the left side of their brain, so that the dominant left hemisphere is responsible for producing and comprehending language in 90% of people. The right hemisphere also has a role in language, but it is less in the semantic content of the word, but rather in prosody, which is the underlying tone of the linguistic message that allows us to distinguish a question from a statement, such as, for example, "This is a cat." This is a cat? Now, to learn more about linguistic processing, we will zoom into the dominant language hemisphere and talk about the primary language centers. So, independently of which of the hemispheres is dominant in an individual, the two main areas associated with language processing are always the Broca's area located in the frontal lobe, which enables us to produce speech and language, in the Wernicke's area, located in the temporal lobe, which helps us understanding language. Broca's area and Wernicke's area are connected in the brain by a bundle of nerve fibers, which are also known as the arcuate fasciculus. It is an association fiber tract connecting caudal temporal cortex and inferior frontal lobe via a dorsal projection that arches around the sylvian fissure. The arcuate fasciculus is involved in almost all aspects of language processing, as well as verbal working memory. So together, Broca's area, Wernicke's area, and arcuate fasciculus constitute the primary language regions. But it is critical to note that the ability to understand language and produce speech involves also other brain regions of the cerebral cortex, which include the auditory cortex, visual cortices, motor cortices, as well as somatosensory cortices. We will now look at how these regions interact by looking at specific language functions. Let's start by language comprehension. The model of speech comprehension was introduced in the 60s by Paul Broca's, and it goes as follows. Basically, a spoken language is first perceived in the auditory cortex. Then, this information is sent to the Wernicke's area in the temporal lobe, where it is matched against the person's vocabulary, stored in the memory, just like a dictionary. This is where the meaning is assigned to words and language comprehension is actually achieved. What about speech production? To answer this question, let's now imagine that we have just heard an utterance from an interlocutor, or we want to respond to it. Well, here is when the signals are being transmitted from the Wernicke's area to the Broca's area via the previously mentioned arcuate fasciculus. As you remember, Broca's area is responsible for the production of speech. So the output from this area goes to the motor cortex, which controls specific muscle movements necessary to produce speech. Now, the last thing that we're going to learn in this tutorial is what happens when one or some of the brain areas involved in language processing are damaged. So a language disorder caused by a brain damage is called aphasia, which may result in difficulty to understand speech, in difficulty to read, write, or speak, depending on where the lesion was located. For example, when Broca's area, which controls the production of language, is damaged, people tend to have troubles producing speech. Their words become halting or slurred, and this is called non-fluent aphasia or Broca's aphasia. Then, when the Wernicke's area back in the temporal lobe is damaged, patients get Wernicke's aphasia or fluent aphasia. This condition is characterized by fluent but totally meaningless speech, so that the words that come out do not make any sense. People who suffer fluent aphasia may also have troubles understanding other people's speech. When Broca and Wernicke's aphasia are both present, then people have something that is called Globa's aphasia. This affects language processing globally instead of a subfunction of it, such as in the previous cases. Finally, a damage to the arcuate fasciculus, which connects the two regions, results in the so-called conduction aphasia, whereby the ability to conduct information between listening and speaking is disrupted. This, for example, impacts the ability to repeat language despite it being understood. These are the most common types of aphasia, but there are also many others representing disturbances of all possible language functions that we perform every day. Together in this tutorial, we have covered the topics of language lateralization, main language areas, as well as how they interact with each other to understand and produce language. We also learned what happens when regions related to language processing are damaged. Now, based on all information that we have learned today, I would like you to think of an answer to the following question. Do you think that people who suffer Wernicke's aphasia understand whether an utterance is a question or a statement? And if so, why is that? Please feel free to use internet or any other source of information to find the correct answer. And this will be all for today. Thank you very much for listening.